On today's episode of Locked On Wild, what positions are the Wild going to need some help at 5 years from now? AKA, any areas they should target in this year's draft.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we will gaze 5 years into the future to see areas on the roster the Wild will need a little help to try to give us a better idea as to the spots they should target in this year's draft. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. And recapping our big question from yesterday, which prospect do you think will have the biggest impact in 2024, 2025? Best comment leads off today's episode. Now, I will mention for Denny's appearance on Monday night, we're going to go Monday night at 8 p.m. for Denny's next appearance, Father's Day weekend. So we are just going to allow everybody to hang out on Sunday. And we'll be coming to you live 8 p.m. on Monday night. So Denny will offer more on his answer to the question, as well as our focus topic, which will be the top 6. So the comment of the day for today, we're going to go with Trav. I think a kid like Jack Pert could surprise us if given a legitimate opportunity. He has the potential to be a Faber 2.0 with more physicality. He's not a huge offensive stats guy, but keep in mind he played in the best conference in college hockey, the NCHC, on an average St. Cloud State Huskies team. So he spent much of the time defending his zone. He is a smooth skater with good vision that can distribute the puck and, more importantly, get the puck out of the D zone. Time will tell. I like this because we've talked about all of those defensive prospects currently in the Iowa system, and we'll talk more about them here in just a little bit. But it does feel like there's an opportunity for somebody to kind of rise out of that group, and Pert certainly has the pedigree to be able to do that. So Trav gets the comment of the day for yesterday, and we'll see who gets it here for today. Now, as I mentioned, let's fast forward a few years, because as has been pointed out quite regularly with our draft coverage, and it's accurate, it's hard to tell with these kids at this point because they still have a lot of their game to develop. They haven't finished growing in a lot of cases, almost every case. And so it's really hard to kind of project what you can add in to your your roster, because we're not going to see these players for somewhere around 4 or 5 years. So what we're going to try to do is look forward, see where we'll be short, and areas that should be targeted here this season. And so if we look at the Wild roster, courtesy of Cap Friendly, as it will continue to exist for a little while yet, if we go to 2028, 2029, now, full disclosure, by that point, this Minnesota Wild roster could look completely different. The only players really that are still under contract as of right now are Matt Boldy and Joel Eriksson Ek. You've got Kirill Kaprizov, whose deal comes up in a couple of years. All of the non-movable extensions will be off the books, including Freddie Gaudreau's at that point. But you will have other players that will be signed to long-term deals. There's a lot at play in 2028, 2029. So just in first glance, it is kind of a blank canvas, but I want to start with one spot that I think could be an interesting one that I do think needs a little bit of attention, and that's the goalie position. Now, full disclosure, when drafting, and if I've said this, I will, going forward, say this as many times as is needed. When you are drafting, you draft best player available. We saw what happened last year when the Minnesota Wild tried to select Charlie Stramel to fill a size need. Not off to a great start, which is why the prevailing theory is best player available. You take talent and you work talent into your system. You deal with that later. But let's consider a couple of things. So the goalie situation. Marc-Andre Fleury will be off the books after this year. This is his final go. Not going to be on the roster past this year. The expectation is that beyond this season, it will be Jesper Wallstedt's job. There will really be nobody in the way to stand in his way of that number one goalie spot. If everything goes according to plan, we're going to assume that it does, because I don't really have any reason to think that it won't. Even 5 years down the line, you're likely going to have Jesper as your number one goalie. But the reason that the goalie position would probably not be a bad idea to at least take a look at is because what else do you have in your system at this point? You have in the minors, you've got Samuel Levi, you've got Hunter Jones, who is a restricted free agent. The point is you don't have anybody really that comes next. Not even as like a successor, because the hope is that Jesper will be here for a very long time and will be a productive goalie for a very long time. So you're not looking necessarily successor, but just to have somebody else in the system to be able to fill in if needed, to be able to be the number two goalie on this team within those 5 years. The Wild don't really have anybody unless Levi really impresses as he did in the World Championships. Beyond that, you don't really have anybody in the system at this point. So not a bad idea to take a potential flyer on a goalie to add into the system. And there are a couple of names that are intriguing to me, and we'll dive a little more into them as we get closer to the draft. Not anybody that's a first-round pick. In fact, in just looking at the top 100 prospect rankings for this year's draft, there are, I think, 2 goalies in the top 100. So it's not somebody that you would throw a first or a second round pick at, but you've got guys like Mikhail Yegorov of Omaha in the USHL, the number one ranked goalie amongst North American goalies. 6'5", 188. Very smart. His technical game is sound. Here's a kid that has size, moves well with great structure in his game, according to NHL.com. Carter George of the Owen Sounds, 6'1", 194. Put up great numbers in the Hlinka Gretzky Cup in August with a 2.25 goals against average and an .889 save percentage. Emil Vinny from Finland in the professional league in Finland, 6'3", 187. Nicholas Kempf of the USA U18 team, 23-7-2 with the 2.99 goals against average, an .897 save percentage, 6'2", 189. So you've got some options for the goalie position if you want to sink, a fourth round pick or later into a goalie just to get them into your system within the next couple of years and see what they're capable of. I don't think that's a bad idea because, as I said, you really don't have anybody behind Jesper at this point. So that would not be a spot that I would be, honestly, put it on the priorities list to just get somebody in the system. that can potentially help out down the line. Now, obviously, the other one, and it is a very defenseman-heavy draft, especially at the top. There are a lot of good defensemen that will be going at the top of this draft. Let's just look at what the Wild have in 2028, 2029. I'll give you a hint. Nothing at this point. Now, Brock Faber will be getting extended at some point between now and next offseason. He'll be getting extended. So you'll have Brock Faber at that point, and you are hoping that someone in the vein of Jack Pert, Kyle Masters, Carson Lambos, Ryan O'Rourke, Damon Hunt, David Spacek, and I'll throw Simon Johansson in there as well. You're hoping that somebody or a couple of players in that vein hit and will be part of that group going forward, because Jared Spurgeon's contract will be done at 30. Even if he stays through the duration of his contract, he's 37. I'm at some point between this year and the end of his current contract will be the end of the Jared Spurgeon tenure. And so that will be a spot that'll need to be filled. Zach Bogosian, 33 right now. John Merrill, 32 right now. These players will all be off the roster by the time we get to 2028, 2029. So taking an opportunity, if the board plays to you to draft one of those top defensemen, would not be a bad thing either. Now, obviously, 5 years out, you could just draft anything. But you see where I'm getting at with this, is that you have relied heavily upon Jonas Brodin and Jared Spurgeon to lead this D-core. And now it's time. You are halfway there with Brock Faber. Now it's time for the succession plan to take full shape. If one of those defensive prospects takes a huge leap and can step in and be that guy, that's great. If not, then you keep adding players to that mix until you find one. So defense, definitely an area to focus upon in this draft. We'll talk about how things played out for the Locked On NHL Mock Draft here in a little bit. And then obviously on the offensive end, if you have an opportunity to draft somebody with speed, skill, puck vision, all those tangibles that you look at on the offensive side, you never pass up an opportunity to do that. Now, the offense will be drastically different. The hopes that players like Murat Huzdadinov, Liam Ugrin, Danila Yurov at that point, the hope is that all of those players will be focal points 5 years down the road. But again, as much as I'd like to say, do this, the big key, the big thing to pull from this discussion, don't get burned like you did last year. Best player available. If it's a defenseman, go. If it's a forward, go. But oftentimes, when you draft for need, you pay for it. So it'll be interesting to see, but I do think if the Wild sink like a 4th round pick into a goalie this year, I'm not going to be upset by that in the slightest. And so, it'll be interesting to see how the draft board plays out and what the Wild end up doing with their picks in this year's draft. Locked On NHL had a mock draft. We'll talk about who I selected as the Minnesota Wild representative, and we'll take a look at how the board played out to see what the other options were at that point. All that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, the Minnesota Twins are in the midst of a very up and down season. And so even though the Timberwolves are not playing in the NBA Finals, Game Time can still help you enjoy your favorite teams by giving you great deals on tickets. If you want to try to swing down to Dallas to take in an NBA Finals game, Game Time can help you do that too. They offer incredible last-minute deals, all-in prices plus views from your seat, plus their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes all the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. Get this. You can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. Ticket prices actually go down the closer you get to whatever event you're looking to go to. And you can save even more when you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For a reminder, after today's episode is done, you can check out the Locked on Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel, giving you all of your favorite Locked on shows, great discussions, and none of the screaming. All of that coming up to you at Locked on Sports Today. So once this video is done, as a reminder, just swing over and check that out. Reminder that our next live stream will be Monday night at 8 p.m. Denny will be hopping back in as we focus on the top 6. Taking a look at the Locked On NHL Mock Draft. All of the hosts of all the various Locked On NHL shows did a mock draft over the course of the last week plus. And it was interesting to see how things played out. So for the YouTube audience, you're going to see it on your screen right now, but don't worry, audio listeners, I will go through it as well. San Jose Sharks taking Macklin Celebrini at number 1 overall. Really no surprise there. Chicago bounces to number 2. They take Ivan Demidov with their 2nd overall pick. The Anaheim Ducks select Artem Levshinov at 3rd overall. Caden Lindstrom goes 4th to the Columbus Blue Jackets. Tiji Ginla goes to the Montreal Canadiens at 5. The Utah franchise selects Zane Parik at 6. Sam Dickinson goes 7 to the Ottawa Senators. The Locked On Kraken select Zeev Boyum at 8 overall. Berkeley Catton goes 9 to the Calgary Flames. Cole Yzerman goes 10 to the Devils. Carter Yakimchuk goes 11 to the Sabres. Consta Helenius goes 12 to the Flyers, which leads to the Minnesota Wild at 13. And for the purposes of this draft, I went with Anton Silayev. And honestly, when it got to this point, when it got to my selection and saw how the board played out, the size and the ability to still skate and to still be a bit of a playmaker and be mobile defensively was just too good for me to pass up. I just think with what the Wilds are looking for, Silayev being somebody that can help you on offense while also being good enough on defense to assist as well. You could turn this into the Arnold Schwarzenegger, Danny DeVito pairing with Brock Faber and, just wreck people with those two guys being the focal point of your defense. But the other options that we have talked about at this point that were right there at 13 as well, Beckett Seneca, Michael Brantzig-Nygaard, Adam Jiricek. We also talked about Michael Hage, who was taken later. So there were still plenty of options available, but again, there are a lot of good defensemen in this draft, and so the ability to take Silayev and add him in, having Yakimchuk go just a couple of picks before this, just felt like Silayev was too good to pass up on at that point at 13. Which leads me to today's listener question for today's episode of Locked on Wild. What do you feel is the biggest need for the Minnesota Wild at 13? It could be a position. It could be a skill set. What do you think is the biggest need for the Minnesota Wild at 13th overall? Best comment will be featured at the beginning of tomorrow's episode of Locked on Wild. So Anton Silayev, at least in Mock Draft 1.0, I think we're doing a couple of these before we get to the NHL draft at the end of June. Anton Silayev, the selection for the Minnesota Wild at 13. We will finish today's show talking about an interesting rumor that just popped up here today. And no, I'm not talking about the rebrand. I'll talk about it a little bit. We're saving that for Monday's show. Going to talk about a player in the Eastern Conference looking for a fresh start. We'll talk about that to finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Policy Genius. Folks, the world of life insurance is a daunting one, even for those who know what they're looking for when they make their selections. Policy Genius is the country's leading online insurance marketplace. It makes choosing the right policy for your family easy and quick. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. Policy Genius helps you easily compare your options from America's top insurers in just a few clicks. Your work life insurance policy might not offer enough protection for your family's needs, and even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job. Get peace of mind by finding the right life insurance with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com, policygenius.com. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Tune in tomorrow as Zach Zeman will be joining us to continue our quest through the offseason. Looking forward to getting Zach back on the airwaves here. And make sure to check out tomorrow's episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Jay Fresh of the EP Rinkside and his own Substack, very deep in the analytical world, tweeted out this today. And Jay Fresh is pretty plugged in. So I'm definitely intrigued that he tweeted this out. Reports are that Patrik Laine is seeking a fresh start. The sniping winger has scored at a 34-goal pace in the past 3 seasons. He's 26 years old. His contract is $8.7 million for the next 2 seasons. And that right there is a huge obstacle for the Minnesota Wild, to say the least. But the reason that I wanted to bring this up today is because it should really be a no stones unturned approach when looking at how to improve the Minnesota Wild roster. Laine signed a 4-year, $34.8 million contract with Columbus back in 2022. He is currently listed, at least according to Cap Friendly, in the player assistance program. Obviously has not been happy with how things have played out in Columbus over the last few years. You look at what he did this past year in 18 games played. He had 6 goals, 3 assists, 9 total points. He played 55 and 56 games respectively the last 2 years, 22 goals, 30 assists this past season in 2022-2023, 26 goals, 30 assists in 2021-2022. Back with Winnipeg, He had a 30-goal season in 2018-2019. He had 28 goals in 2019-2020. If you want my opinion as to what should happen here, and back in 2016-2017, 36 goals, 28 assists, 64 points in 73 games. Regardless of how the season went for Laine, he's obviously a talent. But I think there are going to be some guys that make a ton of sense for the Minnesota Wilds if we're looking at upgrading, especially their top six. But there are some that I just would probably steer clear of. And it's not going to surprise me if having this Laine rumor circulate that at some point somebody's going to link Patrik Laine to the Minnesota Wild. I just think, we really have started to see some things line up for this Jake Guentzel potential homecoming. If I had to choose, if it was either Patrik Laine or David Perron, I'd go Patrik Laine. But I think there are other options. I think there are other ways that the top six could be upgraded. Not saying that Laine is, a locker room problem or anything along those lines, but you just look at the number of games played over the last few years. He played in 46 games in 2020, 2021, 56 games in 2021, 2022, 55 in 2022, 2023, and 18 this past year. So just even just for the number of games that have been missed, it's a no from me. Obviously brings talent with him, but you got to be able to be on the ice to have an impact. And the Minnesota Wild have plenty of guys that miss time from here and there. So I'll just go ahead and throw a no out there for this one. But again, if Bill Guerin is doing his due diligence, no stone should be unturned in trying to improve the roster. Then again, you have to feel like the roster needs help in order to make an upgrade. Now, I want to talk about just a little bit the events that transpired today in regards to the potential full rebrand for the Minnesota Wild starting in 2025-2026. Bleacher Report Open Ice reported that the Wild were going to their alternate colors full-time in 2025-2026. Michael Russo blew that report out of the water shortly thereafter, saying that there was nothing rooted in reality that that supported that being true. Others reported that people within the Wild front office had no idea as to whether or not that was going on, which leads you to believe that it isn't. And then an official release from the team stated that they have no intention of rebranding with their alternate colors for 2025-2026. Now, they are looking at some 25th anniversary surprises, which was, I think, the big takeaway from all of the craziness that transpired earlier today. So be on the lookout for some potential news at some point regarding how 2025-2026 will play out. Isn't it ironic, too, that the 25th anniversary of the Minnesota Wild as a franchise is also the year that we can stop talking about its two biggest free agent signings and their contracts continuing to be a focal point? Isn't it ironic that that's how those 2 years have lined up? So Alex and I are going to talk about this more on Monday, because I did kind of want to just look into the possibility of, do we need a new coat of paint? Does this team need a little bit of a detailed job, a buffering, as it were? Any other car metaphor you want to throw in? Do we need a little bit of a fresh coat of paint for this Minnesota Wild team? We'll talk about all that plus more on Monday's episode of Locked on Wild. That is going to do it for today's episode. Again, today's listener question: which area do you think is the biggest need for the Minnesota Wild in this year's draft? Best comment leads off tomorrow's episode of Locked on Wild. It could be a player, it could be a position, it could be a skill set. Not that the Wild will draft based off of need. We know how that turned out. But just what do you think is the biggest area that needs improvements in this draft with an eye 5 years down the road? We also invite you to join the Locked on Wild Discord server for continued conversation throughout the week. If you have any topics you'd like to see discussed on a future episode of Locked on Wild, send them to lockedonwild@gmail.com. And we will make sure to get to those here in short order. Got one in the hopper that we'll be working on here probably later this week or early next week that I think will be a lot of fun. And we'll continue to keep you up to date on all things Minnesota Wild as the offseason unfolds. So make sure to like this episode on YouTube, or make sure to give us a nice 5-star review on your favorite audio platform. Either way, we appreciate the support as you continue to make Locked on Wild your first choice and your go-to spot for Minnesota Wild news and information throughout the week. We have new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.